I've been thinking a lot recently about if there's a single thread that ties between all of my sort of frustrations I deal with transit on a daily basis. And as I was thinking about it, I realized I sort of divide my friends and colleagues who work on transit or who talk about transit a lot into two primary groups. The folks that live day to day with transit and don't have a car, and those who do have access to a car. So I guess the question is, have you spent a significant amount of time without any access to a car using transit exclusively? Now you might be asking, why does it matter if someone has or hasn't lived without a car? Everyone can use transit and see its problems, as well as its promising elements as well. The issue is that having a car is sort of like having air conditioning. The second you get uncomfortable, you start to use it. And what that means is you don't get to see a lot of the experience that defines the way transit riders see transit. More specifically, the transit riders who actually depend on transit and the way they see transit services. One thing I think about, for example, is the speed of transit. I find a lot of people I know who live in Vancouver or Toronto who kind of selectively use transit, if I can use the term. They primarily use the rail network, and so they don't really have a ton of experience using buses. And what I find is that they tend to care a lot less about speed because they sort of presume that transit is fast because they only use the trains. I think this is really problematic because I think these users who typically use the trains are a lot less likely to appreciate how buses can be inconvenient and slow sometimes, and so they might be much more willing to say accept light rail instead of a light metro system because they haven't had the experience of trundling along a corridor and stopping at a bunch of lights. Of course, people who only infrequently or selectively use transit probably also don't have the best sense about how reliable it is. For example, a lot of friends of mine in university would often complain to me that the subway always has a ton of issues and that they're really bad. I think in truth, this is often a perception that people get because they ride transit here and there, they have one bad experience, and then they assume that must happen super frequently, and they stop riding transit a lot because of it. When in reality, there's a lot of delays you hear about, particularly in announcements, and you'll sometimes experience delays, but as someone who rides the subway in Toronto on a daily basis, I wouldn't say that you experience a bad delay the majority even of the time. I would say it's a pretty infrequent occurrence actually to be stuck in a bad delay. That being said, I think if you're an infrequent transit user, I think it's also easy for you to underestimate the number of delays and problems people have to deal with, because a lot of infrequent transit users are sort of more likely to use it, say, on a night out or on a weekend, when transit is less crowded and hence less prone to delays. There are also other more minor things than service quality, which often get dismissed as quality of life things, and that frustrates me so much. When you use transit daily, quality of life improvements literally impact your quality of life. And so these often tiny seeming things can have a huge impact on how you feel at the end of the day or as you arrive at work, which has a big impact on your life. For example, night buses. Try to go somewhere in the middle of the night as you would be able to with a car, and you'll quickly realize that walking 1 kilometer or 2 kilometers to a bus stop for a bus that only shows up every half hour is incredibly inconvenient. And try doing that on a regular basis, and suddenly you understand why night buses are so important. The same can be said for weather protection. It's something I talk about a lot, and more than I think a lot of other people talk about in the transit space. And that's because I've personally had the experience of being soaking wet and soaked to the bone, or freezing because a station isn't heated, and you quickly learn through these really uncomfortable, unpleasant experiences where the gaps lie in our transit networks and in our transit infrastructure. And these are the sort of things that you just don't experience if you have a car, because if it's raining, you sort of subconsciously think, I could just get in my car, go directly to where I need to go. I don't have to walk from the bus stop to wherever the destination is and get wet. And you just don't experience these sort of negative things that transit riders who actually depend on the system do. Of course, there's also the downright unpleasant experiences that you get when you use transit exclusively. And it's sort of a strange topic for me to mention on the channel because I truly do believe there are certain trips that you need to make that are better done with a car. For example, something that I remember to this day is trying to go drop off a mini fridge at a Walmart near downtown Toronto with my roommate in university. The Walmart was, suffice to say, a decent distance away because there's not a downtown one in Toronto, and we had to walk with a mini fridge to the nearest subway station, which was a short walk. It wasn't very far away. We then had to take the fridge onto the subway and then walk from the final destination station. And I will say, being even slightly encumbered quickly teaches you how a 400-meter walk is actually a lot longer than you think. It also really goes to highlight how inaccessible stations can be. No elevator available makes it incredibly difficult to get into a station if you are encumbered or you have a mobility impairment of any kind, not necessarily just using a wheelchair, for example. These sort of painful experiences are the ones that you just don't really have if you have access to a car, and hence you don't even sort of think about them when you think about transit and car use and the like. I really enjoyed a recent Not Just Bikes video where it was mentioned that, yeah, some trips are better done with a car, and that's why car share services are so great. I've talked in the past about how I like car sharing because it allows you to make those few trips you really do need a car for more easily and not require you to own a vehicle. Of course, another experience that you might have if you use transit exclusively is having to go to like a whole number of places in a short period of time and having to, I don't know, go to one appointment or one location and then wait for another bus, and then another bus, and another bus. And you quickly learn when you have to do a trip that requires a lot of small hops, how bad a 15-minute headway, for example, is, or how much frequency really does matter and connectivity between different bus lines and different transit services. And so again, these are the sort of experiences that you just don't have if you don't use transit exclusively that really can shape the way you look at transit and how you think we could improve transit. And I think they're experiences that I've personally taken into account and that have really shaped the way I look at transit. All this goes to say that when I talk to people about transit, I tend to take their opinions far more seriously if they have or currently rely on transit exclusively for getting around. Of course, when I say exclusively, I don't mean they don't walk or use a bike, but transit tends to play a certain role, and you know what I mean. If you haven't had to wait in the rain or truly experience how painful a low headway is, you really don't understand the shortcomings of our transit networks the same way the average person who just looks at a transit map and says, "We need more subways" does. I think having access to a car, yes, even just access, allows you to skip the sort of 5% of experiences that are really bad and uncomfortable when using transit, and those experiences can make using transit 30-40% harder, and that makes you get a really inaccurate view of what the transit network is like and what it's like for people who use it on a daily basis. I think talking to people who actually have experience with these problems will really help you get to the root of how to improve transit service and how to improve the experience for people who use it. And that often means bus shelters, not Wi-Fi. Thanks for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.